Welcome to our Bucks Trustees Network webinar. My name is Henry Ormond. I'm the Chief Executive of Heart of Bucks, the community foundation for Buckinghamshire. And we are delighted to have started the Bucks Trustee Network for the trustees of charitable trusts with an interest in the county. And the purpose of the group is to provide a source of free information, knowledge, and networking to trustees that have an interest in supporting communities in Buckinghamshire and also in making sure that they carry out their duties as trustees as effectively as possible. This is our first webinar. We kicked off the trustee network with an in-person meeting a few months ago, and we got some feedback from the group as to what trustees would in Buckinghamshire would most find useful, and so that has helped us structure the agenda for today. I'll introduce our speakers in a moment, but I just wanted to say that welcome to those of you in person for joining us. Thank you very much. And also welcome to those watching this on record later. We are pleased to be able to offer that facility, and in all our webinars in future will be recorded and circulated to the network. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our speakers. So first up we have Lucy Wood, who's the private client partner at BP Collins, who's going to be talking about the importance of independence. Then we have Ruadhri, Duncan and Tom Lindsey from Sarasin and Partners, who are talking about the investment duties of trustees. And then finally, we have Ian Joseph, who's the Managing Director of Trustees Unlimited, who's going to be talking about succession planning and thinking about how you can bring new trustees forward and to ensure that your organisation is managed effectively into the future. And finally, as I said, we'll finish with a Q&A. So that's the agenda for today. A very final welcome from me, and I'm going to hand over to Lucy Wood from BP Collins.
Thank you, Henry. And good morning, everybody. And as you've just heard in Henry's introduction, I'm going to be talking to you this morning about the importance of acting independently as a trustee. Now, I'm sure many of you will be aware, but there is broadly 6 main duties of a charitable trustee. The first one is making sure that your charity is carrying out its purpose. Now, that can cover a whole host of things, but ultimately will come down to what is in your governing document. The next is making sure you're complying with that government document and, of course, any law or legal provisions that sit alongside that. The third one is probably, in my opinion, the most important, which is acting in your charity's best interests at all times. Next, we have managing your charity's resources responsibly, acting with reasonable skill and care, and making sure that your charity is accountable. Now, the eagle-eyed people in the audience will of course notice that actually there is no separate duty there which deals specifically with independence. However, independence is an overarching duty which falls into all of those categories. And in fact, it's only the Charities Act 2011 which has an individual extract dealing with independence. And in fact, that deals with the director of a charitable company. However, the view is that there are some duties which apply to all charities, no matter of their legal structure. And ultimately, those duties are seeking to ensure that the trustees are independent of all external influences. And by acting independently at all times, you can make sure that you are complying with your other main duties. Now, the Charity Governance Code advises that trustees must be independent in their decision making. They must not be unduly influenced by anybody else, and at all times must act in the best interests of the charity, as we've already noted. Now, I'm sure many of you will have seen in the press over the years stories of celebrities or high-profile families who've acted as trustees of charities and have found themselves in hot water for decisions that they've made, usually regarding the use of funds, but also for not acting in the best interest of their charity. One high-profile case which many will be aware of is, of course, that of the family of Captain Tom, who raised a large amount of money during COVID, and his daughter and son-in-law were acting as trustees of the charity afterwards, and ultimately have just been disqualified from acting as trustees for 10 and 8 years, respectively. Now, admittedly, this case centred around how the charity's money had been used, particularly by the family members, but ultimately what the Charities Commission were reviewing is how they had made those decisions, and whether they had acted independently or whether they had found themselves in a position of conflict. Now, whilst the family, of course, said that there had been no wrongdoing, on this occasion, the Charity Commission did in fact decide that they hadn't acted independently and had put themselves directly in a position of conflict because of how they had used the funds, particularly paying themselves for their services. And of course, this has subsequently led to their disqualification. A more recent case, in fact, just this year, has seen Naomi Campbell disqualified alongside two of her co-trustees. And while this case involved several failed duties, one of those being spending charity money on hotels and spa treatments, there was a particular conflict of interest point which gave rise for concern, and this involved one of the now disqualified trustees being paid a large sum of money for consultancy services that they had provided to the charity, and they hadn't had that payment authorised by the Charities Commission. So this alone for that particular trustee had led to their disqualification. Now, I appreciate nobody watching this webinar is spending money on swimming pools or spa treatments, and these are, of course, extreme examples. So let's explore what exactly it means to act independently. If you look at the Charity Commission guidance, independence means the following. Your charity must exist only to further its charitable purposes for public benefit. Your charity must not exist for the purposes of another organisation. And your charity must be governed by its trustees acting only in the interests of the charity. Now, of course, they are quite broad in their description, but that's ultimately the premise of what we should all be following. The code goes on further to give some examples of how to act in the best interest of your charity. We've already said that you must not be influenced by others. Now, that could be a number of people with external influences. It could be contractors who you have contracts for supplies or services with. It could be members of your charity. It could even be people who may be donating large sums to your charity. So the overriding thing is that you must always act independently and not be influenced. You and your co-trustees must always do what you decide is best to enable your charity to carry out its purpose. To do that, you must be making balanced and adequately informed decisions with your co-trustees, thinking about the short-term impacts, but also the long-term effects of any decisions that you might be making. And as we've already explored, you must avoid putting yourself in a position of conflict. So that's where your duty to your charity conflicts with your personal interests, whether that's through loyalty or to any other person or body. Now, they go on to give some examples of where a conflict might arise. As we've already seen with the Naomi Campbell case, that could be being paid for your role as trustee. Now, of course, trustees can claim back any expenses, but you shouldn't be paid generally for acting in your role as a trustee. You must not be seen to sell, loan, or lease charity assets to any of the trustees. You shouldn't be buying or borrowing charity assets from a trustee. You shouldn't be buying goods from a business owned by the trustee, but I will caveat that with unless it has been authorised or it is in the course of something that needs to be carried out for the benefit of the charity. They go on to say that examples of loyalty can arise if a decision involves a person or organisation linked to a trustee. Now, again, that could be a number of people, but most commonly that could be a family member or a relative of the trustee. It could be the trustee's employer, or it could be a charity where they are also a trustee. Now, certainly in my experience, it's very common for trustees to act as trustee for a number of organisations, and it's important to make sure that your duties are individually dealt with for each charity, because each charity will have a different need, and therefore you must not put yourself in a position of conflict. And that's why, of course, we have a conflict register, and there should also be a policy dealing with how conflicts will be dealt with should they arise. And I will stress here that just because a conflict does arise doesn't mean that the trustees have done something wrong. The point is you need to be able to identify that there's a conflict that has arisen and then, of course, deal with it in an appropriate manner. And then the final point that they raise is that a trustee must not receive any benefit from the charity unless it's been properly authorised and clearly in the charity's interest. So actually this feeds into one of the examples they give above, and that might be that a trustee, or indeed the trustee's employer, for example, might be being paid for a service that they're giving. And in the Naomi Campbell case, it was actually consultancy services that this trustee was providing. And it may well be that those services are needed for the charity to be able to continue with a particular action or a particular plan that they have. And therefore it is fine to pay a trustee, or indeed a trustee's employer, for those services, but you just need to make sure that it's been properly authorised and that it is clearly in the charity's interest to be able to do that. So if in doubt, you can always check with the Charity Commission, and they will always confirm whether or not you need a certain payment to be authorised. So having a look now at what a lack of independence might look like. So it could be that the trustees, there is an overemphasis on the engagement with the members of the charity. Now, as I said, those members of the charity could be high-profile members of staff or volunteers, or it could be benefactors to the charity. The point is, you can of course engage with other members, but it's making sure your decisions are not led by them. It could be that there's an over-reliance on services provided by a third party. And again, then the Charity Commission would be looking into what arrangements are in place with that third party, which could influence decisions further down the line. There are also obligations placed on trustees to provide charitable funds, or there shouldn't be obligations rather, placed on the trustees to provide charitable funds to other organisations without the ability for them to agree that this is the best way for the objects of the charity to be advanced. So again, that's coming back to looking at your government documents. So before any payments to other charities are made, it would be looking back at your governing documents to see what the purpose of the charity is, and does that payment fit in with the purpose of your charity. What would the consequences be of not acting independently? Well, the main one is that you're unlikely to be fulfilling those 6 main duties that we looked at the outset. But the consequence of a charity's lack of independence and a failure to manage any conflicts that might arise because of that could be one of the following. As just mentioned, it's likely that the trustees would be failing to fulfil their duties and acting in the best interest of the charity if indeed they were not acting independently. It could be that decisions made whilst either in conflict or not acting independently could actually have tax or other financial consequences for the charity. In cases where the trustees are unable to make independent decisions, there is also the risk that the charity may actually lose its charitable status within the definition of the law in England and Wales. And the Charities Commission has very detailed guidance on this and what the trustees must be following to ensure that that doesn't happen. And then finally, as we've seen already talking about those case studies, it could of course result in the trustees ultimately being disqualified. Therefore, how can we avoid this? And what questions as trustees should we be asking ourselves before making any decisions? So the first one is, are we clear on what the charity is trying to achieve, and how will it do this? So I've mentioned the governing document a lot in this, but actually that is the main document that you should be referring to, because that sets out your charity's purpose. And if you are ever in doubt about a decision, that should be your first port of call, is going back to the government document, and is the decision that you're trying to make now going to achieve your charity's purpose? When making a decision, do you have the appropriate information to hand? In the unlikely event that the Charity Commission were to get involved and had to look at the decision in question, they will be looking at what information was available to the trustees at the time, but will also consider what the trustees could have reasonably known or found out before making that decision. Now, it's okay to ask others to help to collect and analyse that information. I'm not suggesting the trustees have to do that personally, but ultimately the responsibility lays with the trustees, and it's for them to understand that information and, if appropriate, challenge any information that you've been given before making any final decision. And if you're still unsure once you have that information, trustees are of course entitled to seek get advice, whether that be from investment managers or accountants or lawyers. The only caveat with that is that you must make sure that any advisor has the right qualifications and also the expertise to be advising you as charitable trustees. Now, we touched on this above, but we should also be considering what are the short and longer term implications of this decision. What does the impact of this decision look like in 2, 3, 4 years' time for the charity, and do we need to be considering that? Next, we should be looking at whether personally you would benefit from this, or is there anybody that you are connected to, or indeed any of the trustees, that could benefit from this decision? And if there is, then you've identified a conflict, which then we have to look at how do we deal with that conflict. And that leads me on to my last consideration is, do you have a policy on how you manage conflicts should they arise? And as long as you have a policy in place, then just make sure you're following that. And as long as you've followed everything through, you should be absolutely fine. So, to summarize, before making any decisions, look at those key points that we've just touched on. Make sure you're acting independently at all times, and as long as you have acted independently and you've identified any risk, you will be absolutely fine. Thank you, Henry.
Brilliant. Thanks, Lucy. That was fantastic, and a really good reminder, actually, of the fairly substantial legal obligations on trustees. I'm a trustee myself, so it's always nice to have those obligations and responsibilities refreshed, because it's not always something that happens when you take on a trustee role. That is part of the formal induction process, and quite often there isn't an induction process for trustees. So yeah, that was really useful. Thank you very much. So moving on now to Rory and Tom from Sarasin and Partners. Rory's the partner for Charities, and Tom is the business partner also in the Charities division. So over to you guys. Thank you very much for being with us today, and really looking forward to hearing what you've got to say.
Thank you, Henry, and thank you also, Lucy, for that very interesting out there. What, as we both sit on Charity Trustees, it's always useful to have that reminder of what we should be doing. So we've got some slides, and today we're going to be looking really on the investment piece, so what to think about when it comes to assessing your charity's investments. So the next slide, please, Daniel. You will have seen already that my name's Rory and this is Tom. We both work at Sarasin and Partners. I think just briefly on Sarasin, we are one of the leading investment managers for charities. We look after a short 9 billion of charity funds. And we are also responsible for trustee training in partnership with Charity Finance Group. So if you want to go onto the CFG website, there is some useful training here, and we will be using some slides from that. Obviously, we're going to be talking for 10 minutes, but the foundation and advanced courses, which are 2 or 3 hours longer, are there if you want to build on this rather brief introduction. So what are we going to talk about? Next slide, please, Daniel. We've broken down the talk into 3 parts. Why do charities own investments? Tom will talk about that. What trustees ought to know. I'll be talking through policy statements and what should be contained within it. And then the last one is just to briefly kick the tires on whether your fund manager is doing a good job. So with that, next slide, please, Daniel, and I'll hand over to Tom.
Great, thanks, Rory. And actually one more slide on would be great, and we can move straight into it. So why do charities own investments? Well, typically the most common mandate we see from our charity clients, and the vast majority of them are long-term in their nature, is to grow the real value of the capital. So by that we mean grow the capital value ahead of the prevailing rate of inflation over that time, whilst providing either an income or a sustainable withdrawal to allow the charity to carry out their objectives today, and in so doing strike a balance between achieving the goals and the aims of the beneficiaries of today whilst preserving the capital so that future trustees can enact charitable good for the beneficiaries of tomorrow. And ideally in so doing through a diversified basket of assets that mitigates risk. But I think to get to the heart of why, on the next slide, one of the key things that actually most charities acknowledge is that over the very long term, inflation is the real threat to your capital. And there, I think, is there often an assumption that if you leave assets in cash, That's one of the safer things you can do. And indeed, actually, in the recent decades where the level of inflation has been very low, you can see in the 2010s, actually, we had inflation around 2% on average in the UK. You could more or less get away with that. Actually, the recent burst of inflation has proven that that is a less sensible course of action. Actually, when we look at the very, very long term, since the 1900s, inflation's averaged about 3.8% per annum. So there is a meaningful impact of inflation, which is possibly better shown on the next slide, which just shows in graphical form. If you do nothing to your capital and don't think about investing it in assets that might protect the real value, the spending power is quite markedly reduced. And in fact, if inflation averages 5% per annum, as shown by the dark blue line here, the spending power of that capital is actually reduced by 40% over the following 10 years. So what do we do about that? Well, actually, as investment managers, we're really encouraging trustees who have a long-term time horizon to embrace risk and invest in asset classes like equities, so stocks and shares, to a lesser extent, things like commercial property, that have a linkage into the real economy and have been demonstrated to grow their value ahead of the rate of inflation over the long term, and in so doing, allowing trustees to strike that balance between the beneficiaries of today and the beneficiaries of tomorrow. And actually, on the next slide, that's fortunate because as trustees, you have quite broad investment powers. As you can see under the Trustee Act 2000, charities are, as a group of investors, those which have broader investment powers than many others. This is both a good and a bad thing, and I think, sort of reversing back to some of Lucy's comments, ensuring that you have an investment manager in place who can guide you and provide the guardrails for your investment strategy is pretty critical. But as a starting point, broadly speaking, the vast majority of charity investors have wide investment powers, and you should be able to find asset classes that can mitigate that inflationary risk over time. Next slide, and back to Roy.
Yes, okay, so that's why charities need to own investments, but what trustees ought to know about those investments, next slide please, Daniel, is really summarised in your investment policy statement. I suspect some of you will have already seen this. If you haven't, do dig it out. It is ostensibly the roadmap for your investments. It covers a multitude of different areas, and its purpose is to help you make investment decisions and ultimately to assist the trustees in managing your charity's resources effectively and thereby meeting your governance responsibilities. It's for pretty much everyone, most importantly, clearly the trustees and the executives within the charity, but it's also the sort of thing that the Charity Commission might ask to see if, during the cases that we heard of from Lucy, Major Tom, oh gosh, who was the that's it, Naomi Campbell, sorry. So what should it include? Well, briefly, it should have your investment objectives, risk preferences, time horizons, ethical restrictions, and a multitude of other things, which we are going to go on to in a second. But if you turn on to the next slide, and whilst this might appear daunting, there are a lot of documents and industry bodies out there that can help you with this, the most notable of which is the Charity Finance Group's Guide to Writing Your Investment Policy. This is something that we're very happy to send on, but I think it's also available on their website if you want to go onto the website. You can see bottom left there the sort of areas that it covers, from your powers to your time horizons to how you should report and monitor. If you go on to the next slide, you'll see that also the Charity Commission CC14 covers some of this. Tom's already alluded to it earlier, but the suitability of investments, the need to diversify, and the taking of advice are all quite clearly laid down within that. And I would just say at this stage that there is no hard and fast rule. If you have a number of trustees who are reasonably au fait with investments, when you were to ask Tom and I the sort of portfolios that we look after on behalf of charities, yes, the majority are multi-asset, but we do look after single asset classes, those charities which have only equities within them. But the reason that they have those is specific to that charity, and it is being well catalogued within the policy statement. So I don't want you to think that you've just got to go down a single route. What all of this is suggesting is really that whatever route you go down, it needs to be well catalogued. Think about the roadmap, think of all the trustees going onto the proverbial bus. Someone comes along, picks up the document and has a fair understanding of what the trustees were trying to achieve with their investments. And then lastly from me on the next slide, you will see that the policy statement can cover a multitude of different areas, but it should all be linked together. The policy statement should flow from the objectives of the charity, leads to your asset base, leads to your liabilities, and then on to your liquidity profile, etc., etc., etc. I won't go through all of these, but as I said, there are a number of documents out there to help you with that. And back to Tom.
Great. Another couple of slides, please, Daniel. That's great. And on to 15, and we'll just sort of finish off with a couple of things. Thinking about how you best assess your investment manager if you have one in place already or you're thinking about appointing one. So how best to benchmark them and look at their performance? Well, we typically suggest that our clients use 3 measures. Most charitable organisations are trying to achieve some kind of absolute or real after inflation level of return. And that really is the long-term objective of the charity. The most common objective that we have for our long-term charity clients is achieving a return of about 4% after UK CPI. So that would be what we're really trying to achieve on a 5 to 7 year, if not a 10-year basis, a rolling basis. That clearly is quite a long period of time to wait for to make an assessment as to whether or not they've done a good job. And in the interim, using something called a composite benchmark, but assessing their abilities to manage certain asset classes against a predetermined index is certainly a good idea. And at the portfolio level, aggregating those indices in the pre-agreed weighting, i.e. like a strategic asset allocation, for want of a better phrase, and to see how they're performing against that benchmark over various different periods will be helpful and instructive. And then finally, I think assessing them against a peer or a peer group comparator based on the amount of risk they're adopting for you. And there are a number of organisations out there. The leader I expect would be asset risk consultants, ARC, who provide a number of different peer group buckets based on different risk tolerances. And that gives you a sense as to how the manager that you've appointed is performing relative to others and other charity investors who are adopting a similar level of risk. So I think using the combination of those 3 benchmarks is a helpful way to assess performance over time. The next slide just reminds you that actually, whilst performance is critical and clearly is the thing that is delivering the ability for charities to enact their mission and their objectives in the form of the returns and the income that they provide to you, there are other areas that you need to bear in mind that are of, if not equal importance, certainly some significance. Certainly things like the stability of the team, the level of a company's charity expertise, being cognizant of the investment style they have at various different points of the market cycle, and a number of other things that may be of importance to you there. We'll send around these slides afterwards. We won't go through each of these in detail, but I think the point being that whilst performance is critical, there are a number of other areas that you ought to be thinking about and assessing managers on to see if they're delivering in those different areas. And then the final slide, I think, is we couldn't leave you without giving you a few facts and figures. Left-hand side of this panel here just shows the evolution of a traditional endowment style portfolio in the UK over the very long term. Most charity investors have made these moves from right at the very beginning, investing in not much more than UK equities and UK government bonds, all the way up to more sophisticated, globally orientated portfolios that we have in place today. But actually, it's the table on the right-hand side that we want to focus your attention on. And I think with my previous comments on the last slide in mind, just bear in mind that actually the returns that investment managers can deliver, both in nominal terms, which is the first column, and then after inflation, which is the right-hand side, with the various different inflation figures there by decade in the centre, there can be quite a lot of variance decade by decade. So whilst that the grey row there in the bottom right-hand side shows you that since 1900, a classic endowment style portfolio has delivered about 8% and more like a real return of 4.4%, a healthy level of return. If you work up the table, you can see there have been decades of distinct periods of feast and famine. So just be aware of the time period that has passed last. Be aware that returns can be volatile. Generally, investing is a very long-term thing to agree and to adopt. And as I say, just be aware of the environment that you're investing in that particular time. And with that, I think there's one final slide, which is to invite questions, which I think we're going to do at the end, Henry.
Absolutely correct. Thank you, Rory and Tom. That was fantastic. Great whistle stop tour through investments. And again, as the CEO of a charity that manages a small amount of money, you've been very helpful to us in providing the sort of advice and reassurance about what we're doing is correct. So we will come to questions at the end, but I'll just deal with 2 points in the chat. For now, Elizabeth will be in touch with you directly about that specific issue, and we can find out a little bit more detail if that's okay. And Humphrey, just on your point about slides, we'll be sending a recording out, so you'll be able to rewatch the various different presentations, if that's okay. And I'll deal with your question on finances in the Q&A at the end. So finally, then, but by no means least, I'd like to introduce Ian Joseph, who's the MD from Trustees Unlimited, who's going to talk about that really important issue that we all, those of us who are trustees, think about, which is how do we bring on the next generation of trustees and how do we keep our board functioning before it's too late. So Ian, over to you.
Thanks very much, Henry, and thank you, Lucy, for reminding me about the Captain Tom Foundation. They go down in history as the only client that I've ever fired, and I got out just at the right time. So thank you for that trip down memory lane. Trustees Unlimited was set up 15 years ago, initially as a joint venture between 3 organisations, NCBO, who many of you will know, the law firm Late Swells, and a company called Sarasin. And we've been really set up to disrupt the trustee and board recruitment market for civil society organisations. And whether you're involved in a charitable trust, a not-for-profit business, a charitable company, irrespective of the legal form, ensuring that you have a board that has depth is really important. And by depth, I mean a group of people with corporate memory and the skills to step into the roles of treasurer and chair as those positions become available. And part of the solution of building depth and resilience and succession planning into the board is to proactively recruit trustees from different backgrounds. And there are many skilled professionals eager to contribute. However, the reality is that many organisations struggle to recruit trustees. So I'm going to just share for a few minutes some ideas about how you might better attract and recruit trustees. And of course, if we had time, we could deal with some of the other issues that Henry discussed around, developing your board and mentoring them and future-proofing them. But for now, let's just focus a little bit on how do you attract people to your board in the first place. And I think there's some basic things one can do. And the first thing I would say is having a really clear vision as a board to the ideal candidate or candidates you want to attract. And start by defining the competencies, knowledge and experience that you think the board really needs. And quite simply, this involves creating a person specification of the ideal candidate, perhaps based on an audit of the current board. I was talking to an organisation only yesterday who have contracted an external person to run an audit of the board so that they can determine the types of skills they need moving forward. And I understand that if you're a very small organisation, that might be a luxury, but you can do these things yourselves, and there are tools available for you to do it yourself. My advice is to think about the strategic objectives of what you're trying to do as an organisation, look around the board at your current skills and assess where the gaps are that need filling. The second thing is about making sure the decision-making process is really clear. And what I mean by that are a few simple things, really. One is to determine who will sit on the nominations panel, so who will be interviewing these potential candidates, and what level of authority do they have? Do they have authority to make an appointment or to recommend to the rest of the board who they think the best candidates should be? Plan the recruitment process really carefully, ensuring that all the activities are scheduled and everyone involved is fully briefed. Good practice is to engage the whole board in thinking through the requirements and then appointing a nominations committee to run the process and make recommendations to the board. Having been recruiting trustees for something like 20 years, when you don't engage all the members of the board, sometimes problems can occur a little bit later. So try to get everyone's buy-in at the very beginning. And part of that buy-in is the third point, which is about creating a really clear role description. And this is clear, it needs to be detailed, it needs to outline the responsibilities, including any subcommittee roles, time commitment, meeting locations. Potential candidates might not understand what the role of trusteeship involves, and so a well-defined role description can help them better understand the role and the expectations, and can prevent people being dissatisfied on both parties when those things haven't been communicated clearly. Fourthly, having a really detailed candidate information pack. Now, I say really detailed, it doesn't need to be a tome of War and Peace, but nevertheless, you need to put yourself in potential candidates' shoes, and so create something that has some key documents involved, perhaps a link to your governing document, some financials, biographies of the other current trustees, something about your governance structure, strategic plan, staff if you have any. I know a lot of organizations have none. And then overriding all of that, create a really compelling proposition that highlights what makes your trust special. Why would somebody give up their voluntary time to come and spend time serving on your board? And this is, I think, the bit that a lot of people miss, because you're so close to your organization. You know how wonderful you are and the impact you're having. But you've got to recognize that people out there who don't know you might not be aware of that. And so for me, the acid test is, if I read something and the hairs on my arms stand on end, then it's hooked me. It's really grabbed my attention. So tell your story, share about your impact, share where you're going, and you'll like to get more people buy into it. Fifthly, have some really robust recruitment processes. So I always say have a very structured process being organized. I say to my headhunting colleagues is probably the premier skill of good headhunters. So be organized, have it structured, have very clear deadlines and timetables, build in informal meetings with the CEO, if there is a CEO, have interviews to assess candidates' motivation and skills and experience, always conduct verbal reference checks, just don't rely on paper references, and allow sufficient time for recruiting a new trustee. It can take several weeks to complete the process, so don't try to cram it into 2 weeks. I've worked with several organizations where for whatever reason they've had an AGM imminent and they've needed a treasurer in a week's time. Not a happy place to be. The world record for me goes to recruiting 4 members of a board within 24 hours, but I definitely don't recommend that to anybody, and I'm still overcoming the shock of having to do that. Sixth, leverage your network. So you've done the prep, now you want to go out into the market, and I think there are a few things you can do. So firstly, engage your existing networks. I mean, whilst I'm very much into you've got to spread the talent and go as far and wide as possible, you'd be crazy not to use your existing networks, and encourage the entire board to participate in that recruitment process. However, be mindful that relying solely on your current network can limit diversity, and so aim to expand your search beyond familiar circles to attract a broader range of candidates, which leads me to the 7th point, which is about advertising the role. And one way of going about beyond your existing networks is to advertise on volunteering websites such as Reach Volunteering, Charity Job. If the person you're looking for is financially qualified, ICAEW, the Institute of Chartered Accountants, have a volunteer site. My company, Trustees Unlimited, enables you to advertise for free if you have an income under £1 million a year and are a member of NCVO, or if not, there's a modest fee of about £150 or slightly more for a tech solution. So the point being that there are lots of places to advertise at zero or very little cost, and so there's very rarely an excuse not to have your vacancy in some shape or form in the public domain. 8th, widen the search even further. So think creatively about where you might want to advertise the trustee role. Use other resources to publicise roles for free or for a small fee. Consider asking local businesses to post the opportunities internally. I'm actually here at a conference today with New Philanthropy Capital, and I was discussing trustee recruitment with a community foundation just this morning, and the CEO wrote an advertorial in the local press, and that was published, and it attracted quite a few candidates. So think creatively about the area you live. Ninth, consider a specialist recruitment firm. So if you've got the budget and you really want to invest, using a professional recruitment firm with expertise in trustee recruitment can be beneficial. They'll obviously have access to a database of professionals looking for trustee roles, and they can help match the candidates to your specific needs. More importantly, they will typically conduct a formal headhunt of the market by proactively identifying and targeting people. But fees vary, and fees can be quite expensive depending on your size. So our fees, for example, typically start at about £8,000 to recruit a trustee, more for a chair. And there are several firms in the market that will charge twice as much as that, before even entertaining working with you. So it's an investment you need to think seriously about. 10th, prepare for the new trustees. So provide a thorough induction to help them integrate smoothly. Sometimes organizations spend a lot of time on those first 9 points. They get some great people, and then the people fall at the first hurdle and they're not integrated. So think about what an induction should look like, covering your mission, your plans, your objectives, recent meeting minutes. Ensure that the individuals that are joining the board get to meet some of the team, perhaps offer a buddy or a mentor from the board to really support and help them. And finally, just to think about if you're getting professionals from the private sector, how you translate your language. So remember that professionals from the private sector may not be familiar with the not-for-profit environment, and so avoid jargon and explain that decision-making in the sector is often more collaborative and built around consensus building than command and control and other types of leadership. Just to finish on a positive note, I was with a group of 40 partners from Ernst & Young, EY, last night. We run a program called Step on Board, where we help senior executives transition onto non-profit boards. And there was so much enthusiasm from these partners to want to join boards of organizations. So it's not that there is a dearth of supply, it's more you have to think creatively about how to reach them. But the people are definitely there. Something you just got to work a bit hard to do that. So anyway, Henry, that's it. I hope that's been helpful.
That's fantastic. Thank you, Ian. Great whistle-stop tour again through the complexities and the challenges associated with trustee recruitment. And again, having gone through that process several times myself, I know just how hard it can be to find good people, and applying a process and moving away from the sort of tap on the shoulder method, which charities have been guilty of historically, is a great thing to do to build that sort of diversity of thought and experience on a board, and charities of all sizes need that. So we're going to move swiftly into the Q&A now, if that's okay. So I've got a question in the chat, which is I'm assuming directed at Tom and Rory, and I'll just read it out for the benefit of the screen. Can you comment on the implied conflict between, number one, the duty to spend the charity's funds on its objects, subject to keeping an appropriate level of reserves, and two, the concept of having sufficient excess reserves to be able to consider investments without compromising the future of the charity? So I think that question is about the balance between, drawing down on investment income, and and maintaining a decent level of reserve in the case. And I think it's interesting, just while I give you some thinking time, to note the government's sort of position on charitable expenditure from endowed charitable trusts, and potentially the thought to impose some sort of minimum percentage of expenditure, which I think is in up for debate at the moment, shall we say, by the new government. But yeah, I wonder what your thoughts were on that, Tom and Rory.
Well, thanks, Henry, and a good question, because it really comes to the heart of what we're thinking or should be thinking about when it comes to our investments. If we were sitting in the US today, we would have a mandatory spend of 5%. We'd also be slightly concerned about who our next president's going to be. But if we are now in this country, we don't have that prescription of a figure that we need to spend. So it really comes back to the point that Tom was making about the mix between spending enough for today's beneficiaries and also having enough for the beneficiaries of tomorrow. Ultimately, as trustees, we want to hand over the baton and say, look, the pot of money that we inherited is still there, and look at what we've managed to do with it for our beneficiaries. Now, there will be periods when there may be a marketing spend or a building project, or indeed, if you're in a hospice, an expansion program where you need to ease into that capital. But as long as you know that you're going to replenish it, that's all very doable. But ultimately, it's that balance that we're looking for. Enough income to satiate the needs of today's beneficiaries, whilst not depleting the capital or indeed allowing the capital to build up unnecessarily over time for the beneficiaries of tomorrow. I don't know if you'd add anything, John.
Yeah, I guess to put some numbers to it, I think that final slide I put up, which showed that since 1900, you've had real returns, about 4.4% per annum. From today, given the fairly strong returns we've had over the last couple of decades, and yes, we've had heightened inflation in the last 2 or 3 years, but actually, given the strong returns we've had last year and this year, we're sort of in positive real return territory. We are looking at a sustainable spending level of between 3.5% and 4%. We think is consistent with that balance that we already mentioned between the beneficiaries of today and the beneficiaries of tomorrow. I mean, we look after organisations that are quite deliberately spending significantly more than that and knowingly doing so. And I'm quite comfortable with tipping the balance in favour of today's beneficiaries, and I think I've articulated the reasons for that sufficiently for them. Conversely, others know that they have got something that's further down the track they need to be building for and are probably underspending today, and the knowledge that the capital is going to be needed in different ways in the future. So there is no one size fits all. If there are no good reasons to be tipping you in one way or another, something between 3.5% and 4% per annum from a traditional style endowment portfolio would be a sensible starting point.
Brilliant, thanks guys. And yeah, I think really interesting to keep an eye on what the Labour government does in terms of that minimum expenditure, and whether they follow the US and do a 5%. It's been interesting, not a huge change, but certainly interesting to have it mandated like that from government. I'm going to come to some pre-prepared questions now from people, pre-submitted questions from people who weren't able to be here today. So one I think is probably best aimed at you, Lucy, if that's okay. And in terms of in your experience or things that you've heard, what's the most common governance challenge trustees, particularly of small trusts, face, and how perhaps can these be addressed?
That's a good question. And I don't think I have a set answer, which I appreciate is then not answering the question. Every charity is very different. Their purposes are all very different, and that's why it's almost sort of impossible to give an exact answer. I would say particularly for smaller charities, actually the question we've just answered probably relates is actually spending the money. So it could be that their governance document is very outdated. Thinking of one in particular charity that I came across, actually they were struggling to give away the money because the objects just didn't exist anymore. The need had fallen away, and if you're dealing with a particularly old document, which a lot of smaller trusts are, that can be an issue. So it might be the case that they need to update their governance documents and refresh their objects. I think succession planning is a huge issue for smaller charitable trusts, and particularly if they are heavily family oriented. Just because you're a family member doesn't necessarily mean you're the right person to act as a trustee, but then getting an external person in when it is family oriented is also very difficult. So that is definitely a challenge. And also time. just time for people to actually run. There's a lot of family trusts that they've passed through the years onto various different family members. Lives are a lot busier now than perhaps they were 50, 60 years ago. People are juggling a lot of things, and it's just having that right time available to commit to the charity and make sure that they're carrying out the vast duties that they have. And of course, keeping on top of those duties and the changes. Sorry, that's a lot, but there is a lot. There's a lot for them to face, unfortunately.
Yeah, no, fantastic. I think particularly the charitable objects point is really interesting. It's something we come across a lot at the Community Foundation when we're helping some of the very old charitable trusts in the area, and sometimes the charitable objects are written in such a way that they're just not really fit for purpose anymore, and it's very hard to conduct your grant making activities in a way that really does make beneficial changes to the local community. Exactly. So one of the oldest trusts we manage, for example, is over 500 years old. So you can imagine the wording.
I was just about to say, I'd love to, from a legal point of view, I'd love to see the wording of that.
Fortunately, it's related to poverty, actually. So and sadly, poverty was around then and is still around now. So it's one of those intractable issues. But yeah, I think that's a really, really good point. Thanks, Lucy. So a question that came in via email about recruitment of trustees. So for you, Ian, what strategies have you found most effective in attracting younger or less experienced trustees and sort of, I guess, helping with their development?
Yeah, so let me deal with the development bit first. I think it's really important that if you have a young trustee joining the board, they have a buddy or a mentor, or someone with a bit of experience that they can go to. It's very intimidating for a young person to join a board of established trustees, particularly if they're of a certain age, and you have to really think about that. In terms of recruiting young trustees, there are some fantastic networks that you can tap into. So there's a movement called the Young Trustee Movement, and it's a sort of galvanization of hundreds, perhaps thousands of young people who either have trustee roles or are actively seeking trustee roles. And they have a LinkedIn page. You can go on their page and advertise your vacancies. So plugging in with the Young Trustee Movement is a great tactic. Another tactic, there's an organization called Next Up, and they work with, is it Next Up or Step Up? Something up, and they work with youngsters and help them. I think the other tactic one needs to think about is, how do young people consume information and where do they consume it? And they're probably not, reading The Guardian and not in the traditional places. So your social media strategy needs to be really important. And then think about the language that you're using. If it's all governance speak, that can be quite off-putting. I think this leads into a bigger issue about the perception of trusteeships, and there is a perception that it's to preserve the white middle classes, and that needs to really be broken down. In fact, we're sponsoring a chap to do a PhD at the moment on all the reasons behind why people don't put themselves forward. But if I just say something really positive, and then I'll shut up, there are lots of young people really wanting to engage. So we work with KPMG, for example, and we're working with a big group of their graduates specifically on helping them become charity trustees. Similarly, we're working with a global private equity company called Advent International, and we're working with some of their folk who are kind of late 20s, early 30s. So it might not be the real youth, because they really want them to become trustees. I've helped 2 people in their teens join the board of ActionAid in the past. And when I was chairing a national children's charity, I made sure I recruited a 21-year-old. So they're there, but you've got to speak the language and know how to reach out to them.
Oh, fantastic. Thank you, Ian. There's a question in the chat for you. I don't know if you can see that. I'm going to throw very, very quickly to Rory and Tom on a question that was submitted that I really do want to try and get an answer to. And appreciate there's only a couple of minutes left, so in 60 seconds or less, Rory and Tom, how do you ensure investments align with ethical principles? I think that's a really important question. I know something that Sarasin look at quite seriously, so I just wondered if you could give a very, very brief answer to how you deal with that sort of ethical and sustainable investment and all that sort of thing.
Yeah, tough one for 60 seconds, Henry. I'll give it a go. I think the first thing to say is ethics. We typically ensure the preserve of the organisation. So any ethical restrictions or identifying companies, sectors, industries that don't align with the charity's mission should very much be in the preserve of the organisation. And that's really for the trustees or the investment committee to come up with a list, if indeed there are any, of those areas that they want to avoid investing in. And I think ensure that those restrictions are enshrined in the investment policy statement that Rory mentioned. The more positive elements around responsible and sustainable investing is all about appointing a manager who has those qualities and priorities at the core of their investment process. So that really comes back to what we were saying earlier about holding an appointment process that is prioritising environmental, social and governance qualities and skills as a key part of that assessment and appointment criteria at the outset, because that really is going to be something that is dictated by the investment manager rather than the board themselves.
And very quickly, because we're over 60 seconds, if you go onto a website, you will find an ethical exclusion booklet which explains all of the ethical exclusions that we've come across, the mainstream ones, the implications, and how you then take them on within your policy, because just having a 10% turnover restriction might not actually get you to where you want to be. So that's there on our website if you would like to delve further into the subject.
Brilliant, thank you. That was a fantastic effort at summarising a very complicated topic in a very short space of time. I'm going to finish with the final question for Ian. Again, I'm going to try and cut that time down even more from 60 seconds, Ian, if that's okay. But is there a template of a skills audit that you might recommend as a starting point, or a way of dealing with that kind of current level of skills and experience on the board?
Yeah, I've seen all kinds of different templates. You might want to look at NCBO. They a few years back absorbed a knowledge sort of pool with loads of templates of all sorts of different things, and I'm 90% sure I have downloaded a skills audit template from the NCBO website, so it should still be there. Definitely look at that. But if you Google it just more broadly, you will find different ways of doing this. Some are highly over-engineered and run into pages. I think the best ones are a simple one-page spreadsheet, and you have the names of your trustees, the skills categories, and then you can ask people to select what skills they have, and then it's very obvious the gaps that you're missing. But make sure you align it to your strategic objectives. That's really important.
Fantastic, thank you, Ian. Right, I think that leaves it for me to draw things to a close. So I wanted to just briefly reflect on the importance of being trustees. I know there's a lot of information to take in, but actually it's a critical role for society. It's unpaid. It requires it's a labour of love. There's a lot of responsibilities to think about, but I'm very grateful to our speakers today, Lucy Wood from BP Collins, Rory and Tom from Sarasin and Partners, and Ian from Trustees Unlimited, for taking the time to share your expertise with us. Thank you very much, everybody. I wish you a positive rest of the week, and all the best.